Back at the loom mill, the group collapsed into their makeshift chairs and onto piles of scavenged furniture, exhaustion settling into their bones. The adrenaline from the fight was wearing off, replaced by an eerie stillness that none of them wanted to break. Ren kicked off her boots and leaned back in an old office chair, her spear resting across her lap. So, what now? We keep doing this? Hunting monsters? Because I'm pretty sure we're not going back to school on Monday. Scotty groaned from his spot on the floor, his head resting on a bundle of blankets. School? Home? Are you kidding me? None of that matters anymore. I mean, are you gonna write an essay about dogmen for English class? Johnny sat at the workbench, the .44 Magnum disassembled in front of him as he cleaned it methodically. His expression was distant, focused. We've already crossed the line. There's no going back. Not after what we've seen. Ren smirked, though it didn't reach her eyes. Yeah, no shit. Even if we wanted to go back, it's not like we can just explain this to people. Johnny nodded. Exactly. We're off the grid now. That means no attachments, no paper trails, nothing that ties us back to the lives we had before. Scotty sat up, blinking. Wait, are you saying we should, what? Delete ourselves? Ren tilted her head thoughtfully. He's not wrong. If we're going to keep doing this, the last thing we need is for someone to connect the dots. Imagine the cops showing up, asking why we were carrying stolen shotguns into the woods. Scotty's face paled. And what happens if someone finds the van? Or the mill? What if they trace it back to us? Johnny leaned back in his chair, his eyes shadowed. That's exactly why we need to get rid of anything that ties us to who we were. Ren nodded. All right, so how do we do that? We're talking about erasing birth certificates, school records, driver's licenses, basically everything. Johnny turned to the stack of scavenged computers and servers in the corner of the mill. We've already got the tools. If we can get into the right systems, we can wipe it all. School records, DMV databases, anything that could link us to this place. Scotty groaned, running a hand through his hair. Oh, great. So now we're hackers, too. Ren grinned. We're whatever we need to be. Johnny stood, his movements deliberate. It's not just about survival. If we're going to keep doing this, we can't have distractions. No one asking questions, no one looking for us. We cut ties, and we do it fast. Scotty hesitated, glancing between Johnny and Ren. But, what about our families? Our friends? Are we just supposed to disappear? Ren's expression softened, but only slightly. You're kidding yourself if you think we can have normal lives after this, Scotty. We're already ghosts. This just makes it official. Scotty fell silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. Johnny stepped closer, his voice steady. "Look, I'm not saying it's easy. But if we don't do this now, it'll come back to bite us later. The monsters out there? They're not the only things we need to worry about." Ren tapped her fingers on the edge of the chair. "All right, then. Let's do it. We've got the gear. We've got the brains. And, well, Scotty can keep us company while we do the hard work." Scotty glared at her, but there was no real malice in it. "Ha, ha. Very funny." Over the next few days, the group dove into their new mission, erasing their pasts. Ren took point, working with the salvaged computers and piecing together what they needed to breach local and state systems. Johnny helped where he could, his natural focus and determination keeping them on track, while Scotty reluctantly fetched tools and snacks. The process was slow and painstaking. They started with the school system, wiping attendance records, grades, and disciplinary files. Then they moved on to DMV records, erasing licenses and vehicle registrations. Finally, they hacked into local government systems, removing traces of birth certificates and medical records. "This feels weird," Scotty muttered as they finished another database. "Like, super illegal weird." Ren shot him a smirk. "You didn't mind stealing that van. That was different. That was for survival." "This is survival too," Johnny said without looking up. "If we don't do this, we'll always be looking over our shoulders." "You want that?" Scotty sighed. "No." Ren grinned, leaning back in her chair. "Then stop whining and let me work." By the end of the week, their digital footprints were gone. The group was officially off the grid, their old lives reduced to nothing more than memories. One night, as the others slept, Johnny sat alone at the workbench, staring at the glowing VCSN device on his arm. The weight of what they'd done settled over him like a heavy blanket. They were free now, unburdened by the expectations and constraints of their former lives. But that freedom came with a cost. There was no going back. No safety net. They were all in, and the fight ahead would only get harder. Johnny glanced at the .44 Magnum resting beside him, its gleaming surface catching the faint light. He picked it up, the weight of it familiar now, and turned it over in his hand. "No ties," he muttered to himself. "No distractions. Just the fight." And with that, he rolled down his sleeve, stood, and walked back to his corner of the mill. There was no room for doubt anymore. They had a mission, and they'd see it through no matter the cost. Johnny stared at the dim glow of the VCSN device on his arm, the silence of the loom mill thick around him. The others were asleep, scattered across their corners of the base, but Johnny couldn't shake the restless feeling creeping up his spine. The device had been quiet since the orphan's message, but tonight, something about it felt different. The hum started low, a faint vibration in his arm, before the holographic interface flickered to life. Johnny frowned, leaning closer as a new voice crackled through the static, calm, confident, and laced with a weary authority. "Vanduke of the Lancaster Nexus," the voice began, its tone carrying an unmistakable gravity. "You've been busy." Johnny froze, the weight of the voice settling over him like a lead blanket. "Who are you?" he asked cautiously, gripping the edge of the workbench. The hologram stabilized, revealing the figure of another Vanduke, older, with rugged features and a dark, almost military presence. He wore a long, tattered coat, and his eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. A scar ran across his left cheek, and the way he carried himself spoke of someone who'd seen countless battles and survived them all. "I'm Fallout Vanduke," the figure said, inclining his head slightly. "The first of us to be pulled into the multiverse. And it seems you and I have a lot to talk about." Johnny blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. "The first? What do you mean?" I thought this whole multiverse thing was just happening." Fallout Vanduke smirked, though there was little humor in it. "For you, maybe. For me, it started a long time ago. Vault 717. That's where it all began." Johnny leaned forward, curiosity overtaking his caution. "Vault 717? What's that?" "A place that shouldn't exist," Fallout Vanduke said, his voice dropping slightly. "It was supposed to be a safe haven, a bunker for humanity to ride out the end of the world. But it wasn't. It was an experiment on people, on timelines, on reality itself. The ones running it, they were trying to create the perfect survivor. They called it adaptive transcendence. I called it hell." Johnny's grip tightened on the edge of the table. "What happened in there?" Fallout Vanduke's eyes glowed faintly brighter, a flicker of emotion breaking through his stoic mask. "They did things to us, experiments that broke the laws of nature. They gave me night sight, enhanced strength, speed, agility. They didn't just make me stronger, they made me different. I could see through the walls of reality, into places no one was meant to look." Johnny swallowed hard. "And that's how you got pulled into the multiverse?" Fallout Vanduke nodded. "One of the experiments went wrong, or maybe it went too right. The boundaries between timelines shattered, and I was thrown into the void. I saw it all, the endless possibilities, the other versions of myself. And I saw something else, something dark." Johnny frowned. "The false storyteller." Fallout Vanduke's expression hardened. "Yes. He was waiting there, in the void. Watching, manipulating. He wasn't just a threat to one timeline, he was rewriting them all, twisting them to his own design. I fought him, but I couldn't do it alone." Johnny leaned back, his mind racing. "So what did you do?" "I shared my power," Fallout Vanduke said simply. Every Vanduke across the multiverse, every version of us, they inherited the abilities I'd been given. Night sight. Enhanced reflexes. The ability to see through the fabric of reality. Together, we became the Call Sign Network, a multiversal force to stop the false storyteller and his imposter. Johnny's chest tightened. And the war? Did we win? Fallout Vanduke's smirk returned, this time colder. If we hadn't, you wouldn't be here. But the cost was high. The false storyteller is gone, but the imposter's influence lingers. Fractures in the multiverse. Shadows of his lies. And now, it's your turn to carry the fight. Johnny let the words sink in, the weight of them pressing down on him. Why me? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Why this timeline? Because the Lancaster Nexus is a focal point, Fallout Vanduke said. It's a place where timelines converge, where reality is thin. If something's going to break the multiverse again, it'll start here. And you're the only one who can stop it? Johnny looked down at the magnum resting on the table, the cold steel reflecting the faint light of the hologram. So what do I do? Fallout Vanduke's glowing eyes locked onto his. You hunt. You fight. You protect the Nexus at all costs. And when the time comes, you call on the network. We're with you, Johnny. Always. The hologram flickered, the connection fading. Johnny sat in silence, his mind a storm of questions and fears. But deep down, he felt a flicker of something else, purpose. He stood, the magnum in hand, and looked toward the sleeping forms of his friends. They didn't know what was coming, not fully. But together, they'd face it. Because he was Johnny Vanduke. And now, he carried the weight of the multiverse. The morning came cold and gray, the kind of bleak Pennsylvania winter that had become their new normal. Johnny, Ren, and Scotty stood outside the loom mill, bundled against the chill. Their breath hung in the air like faint ghosts as they gathered their gear. The tension was palpable, the weight of their next move pressing down on them like a physical thing. Ren adjusted the strap of her scavenged duffel bag, her spear tucked away beneath the flap. All right, boss. What's the plan? Johnny pulled on his gloves, his expression calm but focused. We're heading to paradise. Scotty raised an eyebrow. Paradise? You mean that little nowhere town with, like, one stoplight and a gas station? Johnny gave a curt nod. That's the one. According to the journals we found, it's not just a nowhere town. It's crawling with skinwalkers. Scotty's face paled. Oh great. Just what we needed. More monsters that want to wear our faces. Ren smirked, though her grip on the strap of her bag tightened. So, what's the deal with these skinwalkers? What are we walking into? Johnny's eyes darkened. The journals say the whole town was taken over years ago. It's not just a few skinwalkers hiding in the woods, it's all of them. They've been using Paradise as a trading post for smaller vendors, attracting travelers and drifters. That's how they get their prey. Scotty groaned. And we're just gonna stroll right in there? Sounds like a suicide mission. Johnny slung his bag over his shoulder, the .44 Magnum hidden inside his coat. We're not strolling. We're blending in. Once we're on the other side of town, we're taking the bus. We mix with the travelers, act like we're just passing through. The skinwalkers will think we're easy prey. Ren's grin returned, sharper this time. And when they take the bait? Johnny's expression hardened. We spring our trap. We're only taking what we absolutely need: light gear, weapons we can conceal. No distractions, no deadweight. Scotty hesitated, glancing between them. And what if this goes sideways? What if they figure out we're not prey? Johnny locked eyes with him, his tone steady but cold. Then we make sure we're not the ones who don't make it out. Scotty swallowed hard but nodded. All right. Guess I'm in. Ren clapped him on the back. Good. Let's get moving before you change your mind. The drive to Paradise was uneventful but tense. The group sat in the stolen van, their bags packed with only the essentials: weapons, a few rations, and tools for their traps. Johnny drove, his eyes fixed on the road, while Ren rode shotgun, her hand resting on the hidden spear. Scotty sat in the back, fidgeting nervously. As they approached the outskirts of Paradise, the landscape grew eerily still. The town itself was quiet, its streets lined with snow-covered houses and darkened storefronts. It looked normal at first glance, almost picturesque, but there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of Johnny's neck stand on end. He pulled the van into a small parking lot near the edge of town and killed the engine. "This is as far as we go with the van," he said, turning to the others. "From here, we're on foot. Keep your heads down, and don't draw attention to yourselves." Ren nodded, adjusting her bag. "Got it?" Scotty hesitated, then grabbed his own bag, his fingers trembling slightly. "Right. Let's do this." The group stepped out into the cold, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound. They made their way into town, their movements deliberate and careful. The streets were quiet, but there was a sense of being watched, as though unseen eyes were following their every move. As they approached the bus stop on the far side of town, they passed a diner, its neon sign flickering faintly. Inside, a handful of people sat at the counter, their faces turned away from the windows. The group exchanged uneasy glances but kept moving. "Johnny," Ren whispered as they walked. "You sure about this? These people, they don't feel right." Johnny nodded, his jaw tight. "That's because they're not people. They reached the bus stop just as a weathered old bus pulled up, its engine rumbling like a dying animal. A few other travelers stood nearby, their faces weary and indifferent. Johnny motioned for the others to follow, and they boarded the bus, blending in with the small crowd. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of diesel and old upholstery. The group took seats near the middle, their bags tucked close. Johnny glanced around, his senses on high alert. The other passengers looked normal enough, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The bus started moving, its engine groaning as it rolled down the snowy road. Outside, the town of Paradise grew smaller, the shadows of its buildings fading into the distance. But Johnny knew they weren't leaving it behind, not really. He leaned toward Ren, his voice low. "This is where it starts. They'll make their move soon." Ren smirked, her hand resting on her bag. "Good. Let's see how they like being the prey for a change." Scotty shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Just tell me when to start panicking." Johnny smirked faintly. "Not yet." The bus rumbled on, carrying them deeper into the skinwalkers' trap. But as the shadows closed in, Johnny's grip on the magnum tightened. Because this time, the prey was ready to bite back. The bus rattled along the snow-covered road, the dim interior filled with the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of old springs. Johnny sat quietly, his eyes scanning the passengers. The skinwalkers were here, he could feel it. Their movements were too measured, their silence too deliberate. They didn't fidget or glance out the windows. They sat stiff and still, their faces blank, but their noses twitched ever so slightly, as if they were catching a scent. Ren leaned over, her voice barely a whisper. "They know, don't they?" Johnny gave a faint nod. "They know we're human. That's the plan." Scotty shifted nervously in his seat, clutching his bag. "Yeah, great plan. Let's just hope they don't decide to eat us here." "They won't," Johnny said firmly. "Not yet. They'll wait until we're off the bus, where they can control the situation. They think we're prey, so we play along." Ren smirked faintly. "Until it's time to flip the script." The bus jolted as it slowed, pulling into a clearing surrounded by dense woods. Outside, a large, nondescript building loomed in the snow, its windows darkened, its exterior weathered and industrial. A faint plume of smoke curled from a rusted chimney, the only sign of life. The bus hissed to a stop, and the driver, a stoic figure with a stiff, unnatural posture, turned to glance at the passengers. His eyes lingered on Johnny and the group for a moment too long, a flicker of something predatory flashing behind them. "This is the stop," the driver said in a voice that was too flat, too rehearsed. The passengers rose one by one, shuffling off the bus without a word. Johnny and the others followed, keeping their movements casual. As they stepped into the biting cold, Johnny's eyes darted toward the building. It looked like an old processing plant, with thick metal walls and narrow, slitted windows. His gaze caught on a line of gas pipes running up the side, their connections disappearing into the building's upper floors. Perfect. The group walked inside, following the other passengers. The interior was dimly lit, the air stale and faintly metallic. The walls were lined with shelves and tables holding strange trinkets and goods, leather bags, handcrafted jewelry, jars of preserved herbs. It had the appearance of a small trading post, but the atmosphere was wrong. Too quiet. Too watchful. The vendors behind the tables moved with an unsettling grace, their faces fixed in polite but hollow smiles. Johnny recognized the predatory gleam in their eyes. These weren't traders, they were hunters. Ren nudged Johnny lightly as they walked past a display of old books. "They're watching us." "Good," Johnny muttered. "Let them." Scotty hovered close, his eyes darting nervously between the figures in the room. "This place is giving me the creeps." "It's supposed to," Johnny said, his voice low. "Just stay calm. We're almost there." The group continued deeper into the building, their movements careful. Johnny's gaze flicked to the ceiling, tracing the path of the gas pipes he'd spotted outside. They ran along the upper walls, snaking through the building like veins. His mind raced, formulating a plan. When they reached the back of the room, a tall figure stepped forward, blocking their path. Its face was human, but there was something wrong with it, something too smooth, too symmetrical. The eyes were bright and calculating, and the smile it wore felt like a mask. "Welcome, travelers," it said, its voice smooth and inviting. "You've come a long way. Please, make yourselves comfortable. We offer only the finest goods." Johnny forced a polite smile, his hand tightening on the strap of his bag. "Thanks. We're just passing through." The figure tilted its head, its nostrils flaring subtly. "Of course. Take your time. Enjoy yourselves." Johnny nodded, moving past the figure, but his heart pounded in his chest. They were surrounded, and the skinwalkers were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ren leaned close as they paused near another table, her voice a whisper. "You've got a plan, right?" Johnny's eyes flicked to the gas pipes again, then to a small access panel on the far wall. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're gonna kick things off with a bang." Scotty looked like he was about to panic. "What does that mean?" "It means when they make their move, we light this place up," Johnny said. "I'll handle the pipes. You two keep them off me until I can set it up." Ren nodded, her smirk returning. "Got it? Let's give these bastards a show." Scotty groaned. "Why do I always get the worst jobs?" "Because you're still here," Johnny said, his voice sharp but steady. "Get ready." The room grew quieter as the group lingered, the air thick with tension. The skinwalkers were closing in, their movements subtle but coordinated. Johnny could feel it, the trap was about to snap shut. And when it did, he'd make sure they weren't the only ones caught in it. The air inside the building grew colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing in anticipation. Johnny's eyes darted around the room, cataloging every exit, every shadow, every subtle movement of the skinwalkers masquerading as vendors and travelers. He could feel their eyes on him, hungry and calculating. The tall figure who had greeted them earlier moved to the center of the room, its unnaturally smooth face shifting ever so slightly. It raised a hand, and the quiet murmur of the room fell silent. "You've come to the right place," it said, its voice echoing faintly in the dimly lit room. "We welcome all travelers here. Everyone finds what they need, and what they deserve." Johnny tightened his grip on the strap of his bag, his heart pounding in his chest. He exchanged a glance with Ren, who gave him the slightest nod, her fingers already brushing the hidden spear beneath her coat. Scotty, pale and wide-eyed, swallowed hard, clutching his bag like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The tall figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on Johnny. "But you," it said, tilting its head like a curious predator, "you smell different. Not like the others." Johnny forced himself to meet its gaze, his voice calm but edged with defiance. "We're just passing through." The figure's smile widened, too perfect, too sharp. "Are you?" The room shifted. The other travelers froze, their polite smiles dropping, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. The vendors behind the tables stood straighter, their movements no longer human but predatory, fluid. One by one, the skinwalkers began to reveal themselves, their forms twisting ever so slightly, a clawed hand here, a distorted face there, glimpses of the monsters hiding beneath their masks. Scotty took a step back, his voice trembling. "Johnny." Johnny raised a hand, stopping him. "Stick to the plan." The tall figure chuckled, its voice a low rumble that seemed to reverberate through the room. "You came here thinking you could hide. But there's no hiding from us. You don't belong here." Johnny's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "We don't belong here." And with that, he dropped the bag. The sound of the bag hitting the floor was the only warning before chaos erupted. Ren moved first, whipping her spear from beneath her coat and driving it into the nearest skinwalker. The creature shrieked, its human facade melting away to reveal a grotesque, sinewy form with too many joints and too few features. It clawed at the spear, but Ren twisted it viciously, forcing it to collapse. Scotty, trembling but determined, pulled a sawed-off shotgun from his bag and fired. The blast echoed through the room, tearing through another skinwalker that had lunged toward them. The creature's body hit the ground, writhing and snapping as its mask fell away. Johnny didn't wait. He sprinted toward the access panel he'd spotted earlier, dodging a clawed swipe from one of the skinwalkers as he moved. The creatures were fast, their distorted forms twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. But Johnny was faster. The VCSN device on his arm hummed faintly, sharpening his reflexes, his senses. He reached the panel and tore it open, revealing the gas pipes inside. Ren and Scotty fought furiously to keep the creatures off him. Ren moved with practiced precision, her spear slicing through sinew and bone, while Scotty fired shot after shot, his fear giving way to a grim determination. "Johnny, hurry up!" Ren shouted, driving her spear into another attacker. Johnny's hands moved quickly, pulling a lighter from his pocket and jamming it into the open pipe. He twisted the valve, letting the gas hiss into the air, its acrid smell filling the room. He grabbed a second lighter, flicking it to life. The tall figure turned toward him, its human facade fully melted away now, revealing a towering, grotesque form with too many eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It let out a guttural roar, its clawed hand reaching toward him. Johnny gritted his teeth, staring the creature down. "You think we're prey?" He tossed the lighter. The room exploded in a blinding flash of light and heat. The gas ignited with a deafening roar, flames consuming everything in their path. The force of the explosion threw Johnny backward, slamming him into the wall. The skinwalkers shrieked, their distorted forms writhing in the fire, their screams echoing like a symphony of nightmares. Ren and Scotty hit the ground, shielding their faces from the flames. The building shook violently, the walls groaning as the fire spread, consuming the shelves, the tables, and the grotesque creatures that had once pretended to be human. Johnny forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming. He grabbed Ren and Scotty, dragging them toward the nearest exit as the flames roared behind them. "Move," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "We're not staying for the encore." The three of them stumbled out into the snow, the cold air biting at their faces. Behind them, the building was an inferno, the flames reaching high into the sky, sending a plume of black smoke curling into the night. Scotty collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. We did it. Holy shit, we actually did it." Ren grinned, though her face was streaked with soot. "Damn right we did." Johnny stood a few feet away, staring at the burning building, his expression unreadable. "They thought we were prey," he said quietly. "They won't make that mistake again." Ren and Scotty exchanged a glance but said nothing. The fire crackled in the distance, the last remnants of the skinwalkers' trap consumed by the flames. Johnny turned to them, his eyes sharp. "Let's go. We've got more work to do." And with that, they disappeared into the snowy night, leaving the smoldering ruins of paradise behind. The loom mill was quiet that night, the heavy stillness broken only by the faint hum of generators and the occasional creak of its old, industrial frame. Johnny, Ren, and Scotty were gathered in their usual spots, cleaning weapons and going over maps for their next move. The events in Paradise were still fresh in their minds, the images of fire and screaming skinwalkers etched into their memory. Ren leaned back in her chair, wiping soot off her spear. "You think they'll come after us? The ones that got away?" Johnny nodded, his gaze focused on the .44 Magnum he was reassembling. "They will. It's only a matter of time." Scotty groaned, slumping against a stack of crates. "Great. As if we didn't already have enough nightmares to deal with." Johnny tightened a screw on the Magnum and slid it back into its holster. "That's why we're getting ready." But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the windows. Something felt off tonight. The air was too still, too heavy, like the calm before a storm. And then it came, the faint sound of footsteps outside, too many to count, crunching softly in the snow. Johnny froze, his body tensing. Ren's hand went to her spear, and Scotty scrambled upright, his wide eyes darting toward the darkened windows. "You hear that?" Ren whispered. Johnny nodded, motioning for silence. He moved to the nearest window, staying low, and peered out into the snowy expanse beyond the mill. They were there, figures moving through the shadows, their forms barely visible against the white of the snow. Dozens of them. They moved with an eerie precision, spreading out to encircle the mill. Johnny's chest tightened as he recognized the distorted movements, the unnatural grace. Skinwalkers. "Shit," he muttered, backing away from the window. "They found us." Ren gripped her spear tightly, her face grim. "How many?" Johnny glanced back at her. "Too many." Scotty's voice shook. "What do we do? Fight? Run?" Johnny shook his head. "We can't take them all head on. Not like this." The faint sound of scratching came from the wall's clawed hands dragging along the metal exterior, probing for weak points. The air inside the mill grew colder, the sense of encroaching danger pressing in on them like a physical weight. Ren stepped closer to Johnny, her voice low but urgent. "They're testing us. They don't want to rush in blind." Johnny's mind raced. If the skinwalkers wanted revenge, they wouldn't stop until they got it. But they weren't stupid. They wouldn't risk another direct confrontation without a plan. That was their weakness. They wanted to draw this out, to make the group suffer. "All right," Johnny said, his voice steady. "We hold the mill. They won't destroy it. They want us alive. That's their mistake." Scotty frowned, his voice trembling. "How is that a mistake?" Johnny grabbed his bag, pulling out a bundle of traps they'd salvaged. "Because it gives us time to make this place a fortress." The group moved quickly, setting traps along the entrances and reinforcing the doors and windows with salvaged steel plates. Ren and Johnny rigged tripwires to explosives, while Scotty worked to set up a signal jammer they'd salvaged from an old scrapyard. The scratching and clawing outside grew louder, more insistent. The skinwalkers were testing the defenses, their distorted faces occasionally appearing in the gaps of broken windows, their glowing eyes watching, waiting. "They're trying to scare us," Ren muttered, her voice tight as she secured a makeshift barricade. "It's working," Scotty said, his hands shaking as he twisted a wrench. "I'm officially terrified." Johnny glanced at the windows, his expression cold. "Good. Let them think they're winning." Ren smirked faintly, though her grip on her spear didn't loosen. "What's the play, boss?" Johnny finished rigging a tripwire and stood, his eyes sharp. "We make them come to us. They think this is their revenge, but they don't realize they're walking into a trap." Scotty hesitated. "And if they get in?" Johnny's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they regret it." The first attack came just after midnight. The skinwalkers struck from the shadows, their movements fast and coordinated. They clawed at the windows and doors, testing the barricades, their guttural growls and unnatural screeches echoing through the mill. One of them triggered a tripwire, and the resulting explosion lit up the night, sending snow and debris flying. Ren stood at one of the barricades, her spear poised as the shadow of a skinwalker loomed through the broken glass. It lunged at her, its claws swiping through the air, but she drove the spear forward, impaling it and pushing it back with a grunt of effort. "Got one," she shouted, pulling the spear free. Scotty fired his shotgun through a narrow gap in the barricade, the blast sending another skinwalker sprawling into the snow. "They're everywhere," he yelled, his voice shaking. Johnny stood at the center of the room, the magnum steady in his hand. He fired once, twice, the shots ringing out as two more skinwalkers fell. His movements were precise, deliberate, his senses sharpened by the VCSN device on his arm. "They're probing us," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "They're not going all in yet." Ren stabbed another skinwalker as it tried to claw its way through a gap in the barricade. "What happens when they do?" Johnny's eyes narrowed. "We make sure they don't get back out." The attacks continued through the night, the skinwalkers retreating and regrouping after every failed attempt. By dawn, the snow around the mill was littered with the bodies of their fallen, the air thick with the stench of blood and smoke. Inside, the group was battered but alive, their defenses holding strong. Johnny leaned against a wall, his chest heaving. Ren sat nearby, her spear resting across her lap, while Scotty slumped against a pile of crates, his face pale. "Think they've had enough?" Ren asked, wiping blood from her face. Johnny shook his head, his gaze hard. "No. This was just the beginning." Outside, the remaining skinwalkers lingered at the edge of the woods, their glowing eyes watching the mill. They hadn't given up, they were regrouping, plotting their next move. But so was Johnny. They won't stop, he said, his voice low. Not until one of us is gone. Ren smirked, her grip on her spear tightening. Then let's make sure it's them. The next day dawned bleak and overcast, the snow outside the loom mill soaked with blood and littered with the remnants of the skinwalkers' failed assault. Inside, Johnny, Ren, and Scotty worked tirelessly, reinforcing their defenses and preparing for what they all knew was coming, another attack. The skinwalkers hadn't left, they were still out there, lurking at the edge of the woods, waiting for their moment. Ren leaned against one of the barricades, her face streaked with sweat and grime. They're not gonna quit, are they? Johnny shook his head, his expression grim. No. This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about dominance. They want to break us. Scotty groaned from his spot near the generator, his hands trembling as he tinkered with the signal jammer. Well, they're doing a great job so far. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. Johnny turned to him, his voice sharp. We're not keeping this up. We're ending it. Ren raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do we do that? There's a whole pack of them out there, and they're not exactly lining up to get shot. Johnny moved to the table where their salvaged maps and gear were spread out. He pointed to the forest surrounding the mill. We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them. Scotty's eyes widened. Are you serious? You want to go out there? Johnny nodded. They think they're hunting us, but they're wrong. We're going to hit them before they hit us again. Ren smirked, her grip tightening on her spear. Now you're talking. Scotty threw up his hands. Great. Suicide mission number 2. Just what I signed up for. Johnny ignored him, his focus unshaken. We'll split into 2 groups. Ren and I will draw them out, lead them into a trap. Scotty, you stay here and keep the mill secure. If things go sideways, you'll be our fallback. Scotty's face paled. Alone? You're leaving me here alone. Ren clapped him on the back. Relax, Scotty. If anyone gets through, you've got a shotgun and a pile of explosives. You'll be fine. Scotty muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue further. Johnny grabbed his bag, stuffing it with extra ammo and supplies. We leave at sundown. Get ready. As darkness fell, the group moved with purpose. Johnny and Ren slipped out of the mill, their movements quiet and deliberate. The air was bitterly cold, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. The forest loomed ahead, its skeletal branches casting long shadows in the faint moonlight. Ren adjusted the strap of her bag, her spear gleaming faintly in the dim light. So, what's the plan once we find them? Johnny's eyes scanned the woods, his grip on the magnum steady. We lead them to the ridge. The cliffs will funnel them into a choke point. Once they're trapped, we hit them hard. Ren grinned, though there was a hard edge to it. And by hit them hard, I'm guessing you mean blow them to hell. Johnny smirked faintly. Something like that. The two moved deeper into the woods, their senses sharp. The faint sound of movement echoed around them, branches creaking, snow shifting. They weren't alone. "They're close," Ren whispered, her voice tense. Johnny nodded, his pace steady. "Good. Let them come." It didn't take long. The first skinwalker emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes locking onto them. It let out a low, guttural growl, its twisted form barely concealed by the tattered remnants of its human guise. Ren raised her spear, her stance shifting. "Showtime." The skinwalker lunged, but Johnny fired before it could reach them. The magnum's roar shattered the silence, the bullet striking the creature square in the chest. It stumbled back, snarling, but more shapes were already emerging from the darkness. "Here we go," Ren muttered, her spear flashing as she drove it into the next attacker. The pack was on them now, their distorted forms moving with inhuman speed. Johnny and Ren fought their way through the onslaught, each step taking them closer to the ridge. The plan was working. The skinwalkers were following, their rage blinding them to the trap. When they reached the ridge, Johnny turned, his voice sharp. "Now." Ren pulled a flare from her bag and ignited it, the bright red light cutting through the darkness. The skinwalkers hesitated, their movements faltering as the flare illuminated the narrow pass ahead. Johnny raised the magnum, his voice steady. "Come on, you bastards. Let's finish this." The skinwalkers surged forward, their snarls echoing through the night. Johnny and Ren retreated carefully, leading them deeper into the choke point. The ridge walls closed in, the pack funneled into a single path. When they reached the center of the pass, Ren dropped the flare and pulled a second one, igniting it and tossing it to the ground. "All yours, Johnny." Johnny pulled a detonator from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the trigger. "Say goodbye." He pressed the button. The explosives rigged along the ridge erupted in a deafening explosion, the blast tearing through the narrow pass. Fire and debris consumed the skinwalkers, their shrieks of rage and pain drowned out by the roar of the flames. The ground shook, and snow tumbled from the trees, the forest momentarily bathed in an eerie orange glow. When the dust settled, the ridge was silent. The pack was gone. Ren leaned on her spear, breathing heavily. Damn. That was satisfying. Johnny stared at the smoldering wreckage, his face grim. "It's not over." "Not yet." Ren frowned. "You think there are more?" Johnny nodded. "There's always more." They turned and began making their way back to the loom mill, their steps slow but steady. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they'd bought themselves time. And Johnny knew they'd need every second of it. Dragging the corpses back to the loom mill was no small feat. The skinwalkers' bodies were unnaturally heavy, their twisted frames resisting even in death. Ren and Johnny had to take breaks as they lugged the first body through the snow, while Scotty, pale and wide-eyed, looked ready to vomit at the sight of the mangled creatures. Back at the mill, they cleared a corner of their base and set up an impromptu lab using scavenged equipment, old workbenches, harsh utility lamps, and a pile of tools they'd taken from an abandoned auto shop. Ren stood ready with gloves and a scalpel, while Johnny leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching the scene with quiet intensity. Scotty, sitting as far from the bodies as possible, muttered, "This is a bad idea. I mean, do we even know what we're doing? What if they're full of, I don't know, death spores or some alien shit?" Ren gave him a flat look. "You're not helping." Johnny stepped forward, his voice steady. "We need to know what we're dealing with. If we're going to keep fighting these things, we need every advantage we can get." Scotty groaned, burying his face in his hands. "Fine. Just don't let it spray me with blood or anything." Ren rolled her eyes and adjusted the lamp to focus on the first body. The creature lay sprawled on the table, its human guise burned and twisted away, revealing the grotesque truth beneath. Its skin was pale and leathery, stretched taut over elongated bones that jutted at unnatural angles. Claws tipped its hands and feet, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth, far too many for its jaw to contain. Ren took a deep breath and made the first incision, cutting carefully down the center of the chest. The scalpel met resistance immediately, something tough and fibrous beneath the skin. "This isn't normal," she muttered, leaning closer. "It's like cartilage, but denser." Johnny moved closer, his eyes narrowing. "What does that mean?" Ren pressed harder, the scalpel finally slicing through. A thick, dark fluid oozed from the wound, its consistency somewhere between blood and tar. The smell hit them all at once, a pungent, metallic stench that made Scotty gag and turn away. "Jesus," Ren muttered, trying to ignore the smell. "This isn't blood. At least, not the kind we're used to." She pulled the skin back, revealing a rib cage that was warped and asymmetrical. The ribs were made of a substance that looked like bone but felt more like ceramic, smooth, and unnervingly polished. The sternum was split down the middle, exposing a strange, pulsating organ that looked like a cross between a heart and a cluster of roots. Ren's voice was low, almost reverent. "This thing isn't just mutated, it's engineered." Johnny frowned. "Engineered how?" Ren pointed to the heart-like organ. "Look at this. It's not pumping blood, it's pumping that black fluid. And these ribs, they're not just for structure, they're layered with some kind of mineral. Almost like natural armor." Scotty peeked over her shoulder, his face pale. "So, what? These things are like Frankenstein monsters?" Ren shook her head. "Not exactly. They're still organic mostly. But someone, or something, altered them. This isn't natural evolution. Johnny's jaw tightened. Keep going. Ren moved lower, cutting through the creature's abdomen. The intestines were coiled tightly, their walls thicker than normal and lined with strange, bioluminescent filaments. The stomach, when opened, revealed the remains of what looked like a deer, its flesh partially dissolved in a pool of acidic bile. Whatever these things eat, their digestive system breaks it down fast, Ren said, her voice tinged with disgust. And this acid? It's strong enough to melt bone. Johnny nodded grimly. So they don't leave much behind. Ren continued, cutting into the arms and legs. The muscles were dense and cored, far more developed than a normal human's. She found strange, crystalline deposits embedded in the tendons, almost like natural reinforcement. They're built for speed and strength, she said, glancing at Johnny. These things aren't just predators, they're weapons. Johnny's expression darkened. Weapons for who? Ren didn't answer, instead moving to the skull. She hesitated for a moment, then made an incision along the scalp, peeling it back to reveal the cranium. The skull was elongated, its surface lined with intricate ridges and grooves. When she cut through the bone, she found the brain was larger than expected, its surface marked with faint, glowing veins. This is incredible, she murmured. Their brains are wired differently. These veins, they're not just for blood flow. They're carrying some kind of energy. Scotty backed away further. Energy? Like what? Magic? Alien tech? Ren shook her head. I don't know. But it's alive, in a way I've never seen before. Johnny stared at the glowing veins, his jaw tight. Someone made these things. Someone designed them to be stronger, faster, and smarter than us. Ren nodded. And whoever did it, they didn't just create predators. They created soldiers. The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. These weren't just random monsters, they were part of something bigger, something deliberate. Scotty broke the silence, his voice shaky. So what do we do now? Johnny stepped back, his gaze hard. We keep fighting. And we find out who's pulling the strings. Ren began stitching the body back up, her movements mechanical. This changes everything. We're not just fighting monsters, we're fighting their creators. Johnny nodded, his hand brushing the magnum at his side. And whoever they are, they're going to regret making these things. The group exchanged grim looks, the flickering light of the mill casting long shadows across the dissected corpse. They didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear, the fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. As the group worked in the dim light of the loom mill, Johnny's thoughts kept drifting to the glowing device on his arm. The VCSN had remained silent during their dissection of the skinwalkers, but Johnny knew its potential. it could do more than just show him alternate versions of himself or connect him to the multiverse. It could analyze, scan, and provide insights into things far beyond human understanding. The thought gnawed at him. If the VCSN could scan the skinwalker's anatomy, it might reveal answers they couldn't find on their own. But that would mean using it in front of Ren and Scotty, who didn't know about its existence. He'd kept the device hidden, rolling down his sleeve to cover it at all times. The secrets it carried were his burden alone for now. Johnny glanced at Ren, who was methodically stitching up the skinwalker's chest, her brow furrowed in concentration. Scotty was sitting on a crate nearby, fidgeting nervously with a screwdriver and muttering to himself about the weird glowing brain veins. No. They weren't ready for this yet. They'd already seen too much, faced too much. The last thing they needed was to start asking questions about why he was so different now, why he always seemed to know just what to do, why he moved faster, fought harder, and why he carried the weight of something far larger than their fight in Lancaster. He'd wait. Let them sleep, and then he'd do the scan. Hours later, the mill was silent. Ren was sprawled in her makeshift cot, her spear leaning against the wall beside her. Scotty had passed out near the generator, his head resting on a bundle of tools. The only sounds were the faint hum of the generator and the occasional groan of the old mill structure. Johnny stood over the dissection table, the harsh lamp casting deep shadows across the skinwalker's corpse. He rolled up his sleeve, exposing the sleek, metallic device wrapped around his forearm. The faint hum of the VCSN activated as soon as he touched it, the holographic interface flickering to life. "Scan," he muttered under his breath. The device responded immediately, projecting a soft, blue light that swept over the skinwalker's body. Lines of data and strange symbols scrolled across the hologram, the glow casting eerie patterns on the walls. Johnny watched intently as the device worked, its hum growing louder. "Subject identified," the VCSN said in its calm, mechanical voice. "Skinwalker variant, type Delta. Genetically modified organism. Analysis in progress." Johnny's jaw tightened as the scan continued, revealing layer after layer of unsettling details. Primary enhancements detected: dense musculature with crystalline reinforcement. Bioluminescent neural pathways. Adaptive circulatory system utilizing hemocyanin-based fluid. Regenerative capabilities active post-mortem. Regenerative. Johnny whispered, his eyes narrowing. The VCSN continued. Subject exhibits partial neural activity despite cessation of primary functions. Neural pathways suggest external influence. Likely connection to hive mind or remote control system. Johnny felt a chill creep up his spine. Hive mind. That explained the skinwalker's coordination, their ability to act as a pack without verbal communication. Someone or something was controlling them. The device's voice took on a darker tone. Origin markers detected. Genetic material does not correspond to native terrestrial species. Subject is an amalgamation of local fauna and synthetic DNA. Likely source, extra-dimensional interference. Johnny's stomach dropped. Extra-dimensional. The hologram shifted, showing a detailed diagram of the skinwalker's internal structure. Glowing veins crisscross the brain, branching into the spine and spreading through the body. The energy they carried wasn't just biological, it was something else entirely. Energy signature analysis. Quantum resonance matches anomalies associated with multiversal disruptions. Subject may be byproduct of false storytellers' incursions. Johnny's blood ran cold. The false storyteller. Fallout. Vanduke had warned him about the echoes of the multiversal war, the fractures that hadn't yet healed. Could these skinwalkers be remnants of that chaos? Tools left behind by a defeated enemy, or worse, experiments from a new one? The VCSN chimed again, pulling him from his thoughts. Recommendation: neutralize neural network before regenerative capabilities activate. Risk of reanimation, 62%. Johnny's gaze snapped to the glowing veins in the creature's brain. Even in death, the thing wasn't fully gone. If what the VCSN said was true, it could still come back. He stepped back, letting the device's glow fade. His mind raced, weighing what he'd learned. The skinwalkers weren't just monsters, they were weapons, engineered with precision and connected to something far larger. And now he knew they were tied to the multiverse, just like him. Johnny glanced at Ren and Scotty, still asleep. How could he explain this to them? That these creatures weren't just local horrors, but pieces of a war they didn't even know existed? For now, he'd keep it to himself. They had enough to deal with without adding the weight of the multiverse to their shoulders. He rolled his sleeve down and stepped away from the table, his thoughts swirling. Whatever was behind these skinwalkers, whoever had created them, was still out there. And Johnny knew he'd have to face them eventually. Johnny sat alone at the table, the faint glow of the VCSN device illuminating the darkened corner of the mill. His friends were still asleep, but the weight of what he'd learned about the skinwalkers wouldn't let him rest. If these creatures were connected to some kind of hive mind or external influence, then finding the source was the next step. He activated the device again, its hum cutting through the silence. The holographic interface flickered to life, the symbols and data scrolling in front of him like an arcane language only he could understand. Backtrack the signal, Johnny muttered, his voice low but steady. The VCSN responded immediately. Analyzing neural resonance pathway. Locating source of hive mind signal, processing. The hologram shifted, displaying a map of the region. The device traced lines of energy, faint but distinct, originating from the glowing veins in the skinwalker's brain and branching out like a web. The lines extended far from the loom mill, heading toward a location Johnny knew all too well. Paradise. The device's voice returned. Signal origin detected. Subterranean network beneath Paradise. Multiple energy signatures consistent with hive mind activity. Estimated depth, 30 meters. Structural analysis indicates a system of interconnected tunnels and chambers. Johnny frowned, leaning closer to the hologram. Underground tunnels. What the hell is down there? The VCSN shifted again, displaying a more detailed diagram of the tunnels. The network was vast, branching out beneath the entire town of Paradise. Some of the chambers were marked with stronger energy signatures, glowing brightly on the map. Primary nexus detected. Central chamber located beneath former municipal building. Energy readings indicate potential control hub. Johnny's jaw tightened. A control hub. If that was where the hive mind signal was coming from, then it was the key to stopping the skinwalkers. But the thought of going back to Paradise, of venturing into an underground network swarming with creatures like the ones they just fought, made his stomach churn. "Are there any other entrances?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The hologram adjusted, highlighting several points around the perimeter of Paradise where the tunnels connected to the surface. Most of them were hidden sewer grates, old basements, collapsed wells. The device marked each one with a faint red dot. Surface access points detected. Primary entrance, abandoned storm drain located 200 meters south of Paradise Center. Secondary entrances, collapsed mine shafts, decommissioned maintenance tunnels. Estimated stability, 34%. Johnny exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The tunnels were unstable, the risks obvious. But if they wanted to get to the source, they'd have to go down there. There was no other way. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing map. The skinwalkers weren't just mindless predators, they were part of something larger, something organized. And if they didn't stop it now, it would only get worse. Ren and Scotty wouldn't like this. Hell, he didn't like this. But they'd all made their choice when they decided to fight. There was no turning back now. Johnny closed the hologram and rolled down his sleeve. The device's hum faded into silence, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Tomorrow, they'd head back to Paradise. And this time, they weren't just hunting monsters. They were going to war. The next morning, the tension in the loom mill was palpable. Johnny, Ren, and Scotty gathered around a makeshift table, maps and diagrams spread out before them. The mill's dim lighting cast long shadows across their faces, reflecting the gravity of what lay ahead. Ren, leaning on her spear, studied the map Johnny had sketched based on the VCSN's data. "So let me get this straight. You're saying there's an entire underground network of tunnels beneath Paradise, crawling with skinwalkers?" Johnny nodded, his expression grim. "Not just skinwalkers. The tunnels are the source of their hive mind signal. There's a central chamber beneath the old municipal building. It's like a control hub. If we take it out, We cripple them. Scotty rubbed his temples, his face pale. Cripple them. Johnny, we barely survived the last time we went to paradise. Now you want to go spelunking into a monster-infested cave system? That's insane. It's not insane, Johnny said firmly. It's necessary. If we don't stop them at the source, they'll keep coming. And next time, it won't just be us thereafter. Ren grinned faintly, though there was a hard edge to it. I'm in. Sounds like a good excuse to stick it to these bastards. Scotty stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Are you serious? Did you not hear the part about monster-infested cave system? Ren shrugged. I heard it. Doesn't change anything. Besides, Johnny's right. We're not just surviving anymore, we're fighting back. Scotty groaned, throwing up his hands. Great. Suicide mission number 3. Can't wait. Johnny smirked faintly, though his eyes remained serious. We'll be fine. But we're going in prepared this time. He pointed to the map, outlining the entrances the VCSN had identified. The main storm drain south of the town is our best bet. It's the most direct route to the central chamber, and it's less likely to be guarded. We'll move fast, stay quiet, and hit them hard before they know we're there. Ren nodded. What about gear? What do we bring? Johnny gestured to the pile of equipment they'd scavenged over the past few weeks. Weapons, obviously. But we'll also need light headlamps, flashlights, anything to keep the darkness at bay. Explosives for the chamber. And extra rations, just in case. Scotty hesitated. Explosives? Are we trying to bring the whole town down on our heads? If we have to, Johnny said coldly. This is a one-way mission. We're not leaving anything behind for them to regroup. Scotty looked like he was about to protest again, but the determined set of Johnny's jaw stopped him. He sighed, shaking his head. Fine. Let's just get this over with. The drive back to paradise was silent, the tension in the van thick enough to cut with a knife. The town loomed ahead, its darkened streets and snow-covered buildings as ominous as ever. The group parked the van a few hundred meters from the storm drain entrance, hidden among a cluster of skeletal trees. Johnny led the way, his magnum holstered at his side and a flashlight clipped to his jacket. Ren followed close behind, her spear strapped across her back, while Scotty brought up the rear, carrying a duffel bag filled with explosives and other gear. The storm drain was exactly where the VCSN had said it would be, a rusted grate partially buried in snow, its edges warped from years of neglect. Johnny crouched down, pulling a crowbar from his bag, and began prying it open. Ren kept watch, her hand on her spear. You think they know we're here? They always know, Johnny said quietly. That's why we move fast. The grate came loose with a metallic screech, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. The air that wafted out was damp and foul, carrying the faint scent of decay. Johnny flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." Scotty muttered something under his breath but followed as Johnny climbed into the tunnel. Ren was right behind him, her movements quiet and deliberate. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, its walls slick with moisture. The sound of dripping water echoed around them, accompanied by the faint, distant hum of something unnatural. Johnny's flashlight illuminated the way, the beam revealing rusted pipes and patches of mold. The further they went, the stronger the hum grew, vibrating in their chests like an unspoken warning. "What is that?" Scotty whispered, his voice trembling. Johnny didn't answer. He knew the sound all too well. It was the same resonance he'd felt in the skinwalkers' brains. They were getting closer. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Johnny motioned for the others to stop, crouching low as he scanned the room with his flashlight. The chamber was massive, its walls lined with strange, bioluminescent growths that pulsed faintly in the dark. Pipes and conduits crisscrossed the ceiling, dripping with condensation. At the center of the room stood a grotesque structure, part organic, part mechanical. It pulsed with a sickly green light, its surface covered in shifting, root-like tendrils that seemed to move of their own accord. The hum was louder here, almost deafening. Ren leaned closer to Johnny, her voice low. "What the hell is that?" Johnny's jaw tightened. "The Nexus. That's what's controlling them." Scotty stared at the structure, his face pale. "You want to blow that up? How do we even get close to it?" Johnny's eyes scanned the room, noting the skinwalkers patrolling near the Nexus. Their movements were sharp and deliberate, their glowing eyes scanning the chamber. "We'll have to distract them," he said. "Scotty, set the charges. Ren and I will draw them away." Scotty hesitated. "You're serious?" Johnny gave him a sharp look. "Do it." Scotty swallowed hard but nodded, pulling the explosives from his bag. Johnny and Ren moved into position, their weapons ready. "All right," Johnny said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." Johnny tightened his grip on the magnum as he crept forward, staying low behind a rusted pipe that snaked along the chamber floor. Ren was at his side, her spear held steady, her eyes locked on the Nexus. The grotesque structure pulsed faintly, its greenish light casting eerie shadows across the walls. The skinwalkers patrolling the room moved with unnerving precision, their glowing eyes scanning every corner. Scotty stayed behind, his hands trembling as he set the first explosive charge along one of the Nexus's conduits. The faint beep of the timer activating made him flinch, but he forced himself to stay focused. He couldn't think about the skinwalkers or the oppressive darkness pressing down on them. He had a job to do. Johnny signaled to Ren with a quick hand motion. She nodded, gripping her spear tighter as she moved into position. Johnny counted down silently, his heart pounding in his chest. 3, 2, 1. He stood abruptly, firing the magnum. The deafening crack of the shot echoed through the chamber, and one of the skinwalkers stumbled back, a bullet tearing through its chest. The other creatures snapped to attention, their glowing eyes locking onto him. "Come on, you bastards!" Johnny shouted, firing again. The skinwalkers let out guttural snarls, their distorted forms twisting as they charged toward him. Ren stepped out from behind the pipe, her spear flashing in the dim light as she drove it into the first attacker. The creature shrieked, collapsing to the ground, but two more were already lunging toward her. "Keep moving," Johnny barked, firing again as he backed toward the far side of the chamber. He needed to draw as many of them away as possible to give Scotty time. Ren spun her spear, slashing through another skinwalker before sidestepping a clawed swipe. "You better have a plan for getting us out of this," she shouted, her voice sharp with adrenaline. "Working on it," Johnny called back, his focus shifting as three more skinwalkers barreled toward him. He fired twice, the shots echoing like thunder, but the creatures didn't stop. He barely had time to dodge as one lunged for him, its claws scraping against the pipe he'd been hiding behind. Meanwhile, Scotty worked frantically, setting the final charge near the base of the nexus. The grotesque structure seemed to sense the danger, its tendrils writhing and pulsing faster. The hum in the chamber grew louder, vibrating through the floor like a heartbeat. Scotty wiped sweat from his brow, his hands shaking as he armed the detonator. Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Just one more." A low growl sounded behind him. Scotty froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned to see a skinwalker standing just a few feet away, its glowing eyes locked onto him. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Johnny!" Scotty shouted, scrambling backward. Johnny whipped around, his eyes narrowing as he saw the creature stalking toward Scotty. Without hesitation, he fired, the magnum's roar cutting through the chaos. The bullet struck the skinwalker in the shoulder, spinning it around, but it didn't fall. Ren leapt into action, driving her spear into the creature's back with a grunt of effort. It let out a choked scream, its body convulsing before collapsing in a heap. "You good?" Ren called to Scotty, yanking her spear free. Scotty nodded shakily, fumbling to grab the detonator. Yeah, I'm good." Johnny glanced toward the nexus. More skinwalkers were emerging from the shadows, drawn by the commotion. "We're running out of time," he shouted. "Scotty, blow it now." Scotty hesitated, his fingers hovering over the detonator. "But you're still in there. Do it." Johnny barked, firing at another approaching skinwalker. "We'll figure it out." Scotty gritted his teeth, his hands trembling. He slammed his thumb onto the detonator. The explosives detonated in a deafening explosion, the blast ripping through the chamber with a force that shook the ground. The Nexus erupted in a shower of green light and blackened tendrils, its grotesque structure crumbling under the force of the blast. The skinwalkers screamed, their movements faltering as the hive mind signal was severed. Johnny and Ren hit the ground as the shockwave rolled through the chamber, debris raining down around them. The hum that had filled the air moments ago was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Johnny coughed, pushing himself to his feet. His ears rang, and his vision swam, but he was alive. "Ren," he called, his voice hoarse. "Still here," Ren said, groaning as she pulled herself upright. "What about Scotty?" "Over here," Scotty called from the far side of the chamber. He looked shaken but unharmed, the detonator still clutched in his hand. Johnny helped Ren to her feet, his gaze scanning the ruined chamber. The Nexus was gone, reduced to smoldering rubble. The remaining skinwalkers twitched and convulsed, their bodies collapsing one by one as the hive-mind connection faded. "It's over," Johnny said, his voice quiet. Ren smirked, wiping blood from her face. "For now." Scotty stumbled over to them, his face pale but his expression relieved. "Can we never do that again?" Johnny chuckled faintly, clapping him on the shoulder. "No promises." The three of them made their way back to the storm drain, their steps slow and unsteady. The fight was over, but they all knew this wasn't the end. The Nexus was just one piece of a larger puzzle, and whatever was behind the skinwalkers was still out there. As they emerged into the cold night air, Johnny glanced back at the ruined tunnels, his jaw tightening. The war wasn't over, but tonight, they'd won a battle. And he'd make sure they were ready for the next one. The loom mill was alive with energy that night, a rare spark of joy breaking through the usual tension and gloom. The group sat around a makeshift table, a small fire crackling in a salvaged barrel in the corner. For the first time in what felt like ages, there was laughter, smiles, and relief. Ren leaned back in her chair, her spear resting against the wall beside her. "I still can't believe it. No more skinwalkers. We actually pulled it off." Scotty, for once, wasn't groaning or complaining. He was grinning ear to ear, holding up a can of lukewarm beer they'd scavenged weeks ago. "Here's to blowing up creepy hive mind death monsters. Best day ever." Johnny smirked from his spot near the fire, the faint glow dancing across his face. He held up a can of soda, his preferred celebration drink. "To winning," he said simply. "And to all of us still being here to talk about it." They clinked their drinks together, the sound echoing warmly through the mill. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal again, like they were just kids hanging out, celebrating something ordinary instead of surviving the extraordinary. Ren set her drink down, her expression softening. "You know, I wasn't sure we'd actually pull this off. That nexus, it felt like something out of a nightmare. Don't remind me, Scotty said, shivering. That place was like hell's basement. But hey, we blew it up, so that's what matters. Johnny chuckled. You're not wrong. But we didn't just win for ourselves. We stopped those things from taking anyone else. That's worth celebrating. Ren nodded, her gaze drifting to the spear leaning beside her. I'll drink to that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly as the snow outside the mill continued to fall. It wasn't much, just a quiet moment in their chaotic lives, but it felt like everything they needed. Eventually, Scotty broke the silence with a grin. Okay, but seriously, what's next? Because if it's another hive mind monster, I'm gonna need a bigger shotgun. Ren laughed, tossing an empty can at him. Relax, Scotty. We deserve at least one night off. Johnny smirked, but his mind was already racing ahead. The VCSN had been quiet since their return, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The skinwalkers were gone, but they were just a piece of a much larger puzzle. For now, though, he let himself enjoy the moment. They'd fought, they'd survived, and they'd won. And tonight, that was enough. That night, the loom mill was quiet, save for the soft hum of the generator and the rhythmic creaking of the building's aging beams. Ren and Scotty were out cold in their respective corners, worn down by the day's celebration and weeks of exhaustion. Johnny sat alone at the workbench, cleaning the Magnum for what felt like the 1000th time. The world outside was still, blanketed in snow and silence, but something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. And then he heard it, a faint knock at the heavy steel door. Johnny froze. It wasn't loud, barely audible above the hum of the generator, but it wasn't the wind or the shifting structure. This was deliberate. A knock. Hand on the Magnum, he moved cautiously, his boots barely making a sound. He unlocked the door and cracked it open, the cold night air rushing inside. Standing in the snow, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, was a man. A Vanduke. The stranger looked older, hardened in a way Johnny could feel in his bones. He wore a long, weather-beaten coat, its edges frayed, and a broad-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A rifle was slung across his back, the barrel etched with strange symbols. His boots were caked in mud and snow, and a satchel hung at his side. Johnny stared, his grip on the Magnum tightening. "Who the hell are you?" The man tilted his head up, revealing sharp features etched with lines of experience and piercing eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. "Sound familiar?" His voice was gravelly, the kind of voice that spoke of long nights and longer hunts. Johnny's eyes narrowed. "You're a Vanduke?" The man smirked faintly. "I go by the Hunter in my timeline. But yeah, you're right. I'm you, or at least, I was." Johnny stepped back, motioning the man inside, his wariness laced with curiosity. The hunter entered the mill, his movements deliberate, his presence filling the room. He glanced around briefly, taking in the salvaged furniture, the weapons scattered about, and the faint remnants of their celebration. "So, this is your base. Not bad. You've made do with what you have." The hunter unslung his satchel and set it on the table with a heavy thud. Johnny stood across from him, watching closely. "You still haven't told me why you're here." The hunter's eyes met Johnny's, their faint glow almost unnatural. "Because I owe you an apology." Johnny frowned, his voice cautious. "An apology?" The hunter sighed, pulling out a small metal flask and taking a sip before speaking. "This timeline, the one you're in right now, is a divergent timeline of my own. Back during the war against the imposter and the false storyteller, everything got messy. The multiverse isn't as solid as you think. It fractures, bends, and sometimes breaks entirely." Johnny said nothing, letting the man speak. The hunter continued. "We fought to keep the timeline stable, to stop the false storyteller from rewriting everything. But even with all of us, every version of Vanduke, we couldn't stop the fallout. The war pushed the timelines out of balance, and a few of them diverged. Yours is one of those timelines. You exist because of that war." Johnny's jaw tightened. "And you're telling me this? Why?" The hunter's face softened slightly, the faintest hint of regret flickering across his features. "Because I came to say I'm sorry. Sorry I couldn't stop it. Sorry that this whole mess landed on you. The dogmen. The skinwalkers. The things you're fighting now. They're echoes of the war. Leftovers from the chaos that the false storyteller created. You and your friends are cleaning up a mess that shouldn't have been yours to deal with." Johnny looked down at the workbench, his mind spinning. The things they'd faced, the dogmen in the woods, the hive mind beneath paradise, none of it was random. It was all connected to something bigger, something beyond his timeline. And now this man, the hunter, was here to tell him that the war that birthed him wasn't even meant to happen. Johnny exhaled slowly. "So, what? You're here to give me answers?" The hunter chuckled dryly. "No. Answers are a luxury. I'm here to give you what you need to survive." He opened the satchel and began pulling out gear. The first thing he set on the table was a revolver, sleek, heavy, and engraved with markings that seemed to glow faintly. It was larger than Johnny's Magnum, the craftsmanship impeccable. "Custom .50 caliber revolver," the hunter said. "This'll punch through anything you face. The runes keep certain, nastier creatures from regenerating." He set down a bundle of tools next, steel stakes etched with symbols, coils of wire, and small vials filled with a dark blue liquid. Silver-tipped stakes, reinforced tripwires, and vials of charged ether. Burns through skinwalkers, dogmen, Wendigos, you name it. Next came a leather-bound notebook, worn and marked with years of use. My journal. Notes on the creatures you'll face, traps that work, places to avoid, and weak spots you can exploit. This is years of hunting condensed into a book. Finally, the hunter dropped a small, metallic device onto the table. It looked like a compact version of Johnny's VCSN, but rougher, more weathered. Signal enhancer. It'll link your VCSN to mine, let you call for help if you ever need it. Johnny stared at the items laid out in front of him. Why are you doing this? The hunter met his gaze, his expression serious. Because you're me. And no matter what timeline we're in, Vandukes look out for each other. I fought these things alone in my world, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, especially not a younger version of myself. Johnny picked up the revolver, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It was heavy, balanced, and it hummed faintly in his grip, like it was alive. The hunter moved toward the door, his coat trailing behind him. You've got a long road ahead of you, kid. But you're not alone. Not anymore. Johnny looked up. Will I see you again? The hunter paused, glancing back with a faint smirk. If you're lucky, you won't have to. And with that, he stepped out into the cold night, disappearing into the shadows as quietly as he'd arrived. Johnny stared at the gear on the table, his chest heavy with the weight of what he'd learned. This mess wasn't his fault, but it was his responsibility now. He picked up the leather-bound journal and opened it, the pages filled with detailed sketches, notes, and warnings. Ren stirred in her corner, her voice groggy. Johnny? You still up? Johnny glanced at her, closing the journal. Yeah. Just organizing some stuff. Ren yawned, rolling over. Get some sleep. You're gonna need it. Johnny smirked faintly, his eyes drifting back to the table. The hunter had given him the tools he needed. Now it was up to him to use them. Yeah, Johnny muttered under his breath. I'll be ready. The next morning, sunlight bled through the mill's broken windows, casting sharp beams across the cold, concrete floor. Ren was the first to wake, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the table in the corner of the room. The gear Johnny had been given, silver-tipped stakes, glowing vials, and the enormous engraved revolver was spread out in plain view. It looked out of place, too polished, too deliberate to be scavenged like their usual tools. She sat up and frowned. Johnny. Scotty stirred groggily, rolling over on his pile of blankets. What? What now? Look, Ren said, gesturing toward the workbench. Johnny stood at the far end of the mill, staring out of a broken window with his back to them. He'd been waiting for this moment. He knew they'd see the gear eventually, and when they did, the jig would be up. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the revolver tucked against his belt and the device under his sleeve humming faintly. Scotty blinked at the table, his sleepy confusion giving way to nervous suspicion. Where the hell did all that come from? Did I miss a shopping trip? Ren got to her feet, walking toward the workbench and picking up the leather journal. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowed as she studied the detailed sketches of creatures and diagrams of traps. Johnny, what is this? Where did you get all of this? Johnny turned around slowly, his face calm but unreadable. He knew this was the point of no return. The lie, or rather, the half-truth he'd been living couldn't hold any longer. I got it last night, Johnny said quietly. Scotty froze mid-stretch, his face scrunching up. From who? Santa Claus. Johnny smirked faintly but shook his head. No. From another Vanduke. Ren stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. Another you? Johnny nodded, stepping toward the table. He pulled up the sleeve of his jacket, revealing the VCSN device on his arm. Its metallic surface caught the sunlight, faint lines glowing softly beneath the surface. Ren and Scotty froze, their eyes locked onto it like it was a bomb about to go off. What the hell is that? Scotty demanded, scrambling to his feet. Johnny set his jaw. It's called the VCSN. It's how I knew where the skinwalkers' hive was. How I knew about the tunnels. It's connected to something bigger than all of this. Ren's eyes narrowed. And you've had this the whole time. You've been hiding this from us. Johnny sighed, his voice steady but tinged with regret. Yeah. I didn't want to drag you both into it. This device, the VCSN, it connects me to the multiverse. To other versions of me like the one who came here last night. He called himself the Hunter. He's from another timeline where he fought the same monsters we're dealing with: skinwalkers, dogmen, wendigos, even the Mothman. Scotty gawked at him. Wait. Slow down. You're telling us there are other yous? Like, alternate versions? That's sci-fi bullshit, man. Johnny shook his head. No, it's real. And this timeline ours, it's a divergent version of his. It exists because of a war in the multiverse. A war between us Vandukes and two forces, the false storyteller and the imposter. Ren raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. A war? What does that have to do with us? Johnny pointed to the vials and stakes on the table. Everything. The monsters we've been fighting? Skinwalkers, dogmen. They're leftovers, echoes of that war. When the timelines fractured, they spilled over into places like this one. Lancaster, Paradise, it's a focal point in the multiverse. That's why all of this is happening here. Scotty looked like he might fall over. So what? The universe just broke one day, and we got stuck with all the monsters. Something like that, Johnny said. The Hunter told me this isn't my fault or yours. But it's our fight now. Ren picked up one of the silver-tipped stakes, inspecting the runes carved into its surface. "And all of this?" she asked quietly. "This gear." Johnny ran a hand across his face, suddenly feeling the exhaustion hit him. "The hunter gave it to me. He said I'd need it. That we'd need it." Scotty shook his head, his voice incredulous. "Okay, I need a second here. This is a lot. Like, an entire multiverse full of you. And monsters. And wars. How are you just standing here, acting like this is normal?" Johnny looked at him, his gaze steady. "Because I don't have a choice. None of us do. If we don't fight, more people die. The skinwalkers are gone for now, but there's more out there. Bigger things. Worse things." Ren set the stake down, crossing her arms. "So what's next? You just use that thing to tell us where the monsters are hiding, and we take them out." Johnny exhaled, nodding. "That's the idea. The VCSN can help us track them, tell us what we're dealing with, give us a chance to hit them before they hit us. But this is bigger than anything we've faced so far. You need to know what you're signing up for." Scotty stared at the glowing device on Johnny's arm, still half convinced he was dreaming. "And what happens if we don't sign up? What if we say screw this and head to Mexico or something?" Johnny met his gaze, his voice firm but calm. "Then they'll come for you anyway. The monsters don't stop just because you run." The room fell silent as that truth sank in. Scotty slumped back onto his crate, rubbing his face. "Great. So now I'm in a multiverse monster hunting club. I didn't sign up for this." Ren smirked faintly, though her expression was serious. "You did when you picked up that shotgun, Scotty." Johnny looked between the two of them, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Look, I know it's a lot. But we've already come this far. We've taken down dogmen and skinwalkers. We can handle this. But I'm not going to lie to you, it's only going to get harder from here." Ren picked up the journal the hunter had left, flipping through its pages. "Hard is fine," she said finally, her voice steady. "At least now we're not walking into this blind." Scotty groaned dramatically, tossing his hands up. "Fine. Fine. I'm in. But if we fight Wendigos next, I'm demanding hazard pay." Johnny smirked faintly, relief washing over him. "Deal." The three of them sat around the table as Johnny began to explain more about the VCSN, about the other Vandukes, and about the war that had torn through the multiverse. He showed them the gear, explained its purpose, and for the first time, they weren't just a group of rebels fighting in the dark. They were something more. A team. A resistance. And Johnny knew, as they sat there in the flickering light of the mill, that they were ready for what came next. As Johnny finished explaining the VCSN and the tools they now had at their disposal, a strange, almost electric buzz filled the air. The sound was faint, but sharp enough to make all three of them freeze mid-conversation. Ren's hand immediately went to her spear, and Scotty scrambled upright, his eyes wide with panic. What was that? Did the generator blow up? Johnny knew better. He felt it. That ripple like something had just arrived. And then, there he was. A figure sat casually on one of the workbenches near the far wall, where just moments ago there had been nothing but scattered tools. The boy looked about 13, dressed in worn, faded clothes, a hoodie with faint grease stains, ripped jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. His dark hair was shaggy and messy, falling just over his eyes, and he wore a smug grin that seemed far too confident for a kid his age. "Hey, Johnny," the boy said lazily, waving a hand as if he'd just walked into a coffee shop. "Miss me?" Ren jumped back, her spear already half drawn. "Who the hell is that?" Scotty clutched his shotgun like a lifeline, his voice breaking. He just appeared out of nowhere. "Johnny, what is happening?" Johnny sighed heavily, rubbing his face with one hand. Of course you'd show up now." The boy raised his hands in mock innocence. "What? I'm not here to ruin anything. I swear." Johnny shot him a look. "Orphan. You're in my timeline. Again." Scotty blinked. "Orphan? What does that even mean? Is he another you?" The boy the orphan grinned wider, hopping off the workbench. "Bingo, buddy." He gave a mock bow. "Johnny Vanduke, but younger. Some call me the orphan. I call myself the coolest Vanduke to ever hit the multiverse." Ren's eyes narrowed. "You're a kid." The orphan straightened, a glint of mischief flashing in his eyes. "Yeah, but don't let that fool you. I've fought killer animatronics and survived a timeline that's basically one long haunted nightmare. I've seen some shit." He looked toward Johnny and smirked. "Isn't that right?" Johnny crossed his arms, clearly annoyed but not surprised. He's from a timeline where, let's just say, things got very Five Nights at Freddy's. Killer animatronics, a guy called the man behind the slaughter. It's a mess. Scotty stared, mouth agape. "You're joking. This has to be a joke." The orphan shook his head, grinning ear to ear. "Nope. I once fought a 6-foot-tall, purple-suited psycho who was literally possessed by his own guilt. Oh, and don't forget the sentient robots. Those were a blast." Ren blinked, trying to process the absurdity of what she was hearing. "And why are you here now?" The orphan flopped back into a chair he clearly hadn't earned the right to claim, stretching his arms lazily behind his head. "Honestly, I'm bored. My timeline's calm for once. No murderous robots, no purple psychos, No kid souls trapped in pizza mascots. Figured I'd pop over and see what Johnny here was up to. Johnny glared at him. You're just here because you're bored. Pretty much, the orphan said with a cheeky grin. Oh, but I love what you've done with the place. Very gritty. Very apocalyptic chic. Scotty turned to Johnny, his voice rising an octave. You're telling me this kid just hops between timelines for fun? Johnny nodded reluctantly. More or less. Not just fun, the orphan said with mock indignation. Sometimes I help. I mean, I'm not helping now, but I could. Maybe. If I feel like it. Ren, who was still gripping her spear like she expected the orphan to turn into a monster any second, frowned. And we're just supposed to let him hang out. Johnny sighed. You'll get used to him. Eventually. The orphan hopped to his feet, wandering over to the table and picking up one of the silver-tipped stakes. He whistled, turning it over in his hand. Oh, nice craftsmanship. The hunter must have been here. Man's all business, isn't he? Johnny gave him a pointed look. He's helping us clean up your mess, you know. The orphan rolled his eyes, setting the stake back down. Not my fault the multiverse shattered. Well, not entirely my fault. Besides, you're handling things just fine. You blew up a hive mind, didn't you? Gold star for you, man. Scotty threw his hands up in exasperation. Am I the only one losing my mind here? We're talking about killer animatronics, multiverse hopping kids, and magic wristwatches. The orphan turned to him with a smirk. You're cute when you panic. Scotty's face went beet red. I'm not. Ugh. Ren shook her head, finally lowering her spear. Okay, fine. He's here. Whatever. But if you're not helping, don't get in our way. The orphan put his hands up again in mock surrender. Fair deal. I'll just hang out for a bit. He plopped back into his chair and grinned at Johnny. Besides, I wanna see how you handle the next big thing. Because trust me, buddy, this timeline's just getting started. Johnny frowned. What do you mean? The orphan winked. Oh, you'll see. Johnny groaned, dragging a hand through his hair. Great. Just what I needed, cryptic prophecies and a freeloading version of myself. The orphan kicked his feet up on a crate, completely unfazed. Get used to it. I'm your favorite now. Scotty muttered under his breath as he slumped back into his seat. I need a vacation. Johnny smirked despite himself. As frustrating as the orphan was, there was something oddly reassuring about his presence. If nothing else, he was a reminder that they weren't alone, that the multiverse was bigger, stranger, and far more unpredictable than they could ever imagine. And knowing that, well, it made their victories feel just a little more important. The orphan, still comfortably sprawled in his chair, looked up from where he'd been fiddling with the silver-tipped steak and smirked at Johnny. "You ever wonder why you ended up here? Of all the places in Lancaster, of all the abandoned buildings, you just happened to set up shop in this old loom mill." Johnny frowned, leaning against the table. "What are you talking about?" Ren glanced at Johnny and then back at the orphan. "You're saying it's not a coincidence?" The orphan's grin widened, as if he'd been waiting for this exact question. He sat up, leaning his elbows on his knees. "Oh no, it's never a coincidence. You don't just stumble on the loom mill. Not as a Vanduke." Scotty, still halfway between frustration and curiosity, groaned. "What now? Is the mill haunted? Cursed? Aliens?" The orphan shot him finger guns. "Not haunted. Not cursed. More like, destined." Johnny crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Explain." The orphan's tone shifted, more serious now, though his smirk never fully disappeared. "The loom mill is special. Not just this one, but all of them. You see, every version of us, every Vanduke eventually finds a place like this. An old, forgotten building. A factory. A mill. A fortress made of rust and history." He gestured broadly. 9 times out of 10, we're drawn to it like moths to a flame. It's just, in us. Ren tilted her head. "Why?" The orphan pointed to the steel beams overhead. "Because it's a convergence point. These places are old, abandoned, left behind by people and progress. But they're more than that. Loom mills, factories, forges, they're anchors that exist across timelines. No matter the world, the loom mill stands somewhere, waiting. And when a Vanduke comes into his own, when he starts seeing the truth of the multiverse, he's pulled here." Scotty blinked, looking around the room. "Wait, so this place, it's like a magnet for you guys?" "Pretty much," the orphan said, spinning a small screwdriver in his hand. "The loom mill is where Vandukes build their base of operations. Always has been, always will be. You're not the first to find it, Johnny, and you won't be the last." Johnny's brow furrowed as he tried to process that. "And you're saying this happens in every timeline?" The orphan nodded. "Every single one. Heck, there's even a version of the loom mill that exists between timelines, literally outside of time and space. We call it the Denmark." He grinned like he was proud to say it. "It's where all the Vandukes meet up. Hunters, rebels, wanderers, orphans like me. You name it. We all have our roles to play, and when we need to talk or share intel, we gather at the Denmark." Ren's expression shifted, a mix of disbelief and fascination. "You're telling me there's a multiversal clubhouse for you guys? For Vandukes?" "Yep," the orphan said cheerfully, tapping the side of his head. It's hidden between the folds of reality, but it's there. Picture a massive mill that's been rebuilt 1,000 times over steel, wood, stone, whatever material each timeline had to offer. It's like a monument to every version of us. It's where we meet, argue, compare scars, and sometimes just sit. Because if there's one thing we all have in common, it's that we're stubborn as hell and we need a place to regroup. Johnny's voice was low, thoughtful. So you're saying this isn't an accident? That we came here because it's part of what we are? The orphan nodded, his grin softening just slightly. That's exactly what I'm saying. The loom mill is in your blood, Johnny. It's where Vandukes gather when the fight starts getting serious. It's where we make our stands. And it's where we build the tools we need to keep going. Scotty threw his hands in the air. Unbelievable. So we're sitting in the multiversal version of home base? Like a Vanduke command center. The orphan laughed. Basically, yeah. Only yours is still pretty bare bones compared to the others. The hunter's mill? Fully rigged out traps, armories, computers, even a training range. You'll get there. Johnny ran a hand over the rough workbench, his mind reeling. The mill, the place they'd scavenged and fortified, where they'd fought to survive, was more than just a hiding place. It was a legacy. A piece of something much bigger. So what now? Ren asked, her voice quiet. Do we just stay here? Build it up? Wait for whatever comes next? Johnny glanced at her, then back at the orphan. We don't wait. We prepare. The orphan grinned. Now you're thinking like a Vanduke. Johnny looked around the mill, the scattered tools, the salvaged weapons, the faint hum of the generator. It wasn't much yet, but it was theirs. And now he knew what it was meant to be, a stronghold. A fortress. A symbol of resistance. The loom mill wasn't just a place to survive. It was where they'd fight back. Where they'd win. All right, Johnny said, his voice steady. Let's get to work. The orphan's grin widened, and for a moment, Johnny felt the air shift as though reality itself were holding its breath. The VCSN on his arm flickered, glowing a deeper blue than before. The device hummed louder, the symbols across its surface glowing brighter. What are you doing? Johnny asked cautiously, instinctively stepping back. The orphan held up his hands, all innocence. Relax. I'm just showing you something cool. This is about your call sign. It's time you learned what else that little beauty can do. His grin turned mischievous, and the glow of the VCSN synced perfectly with the faint hum in the air. You've barely scratched the surface. The orphan snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the device on Johnny's arm flared to life, brighter than ever. Its hum intensified, vibrating through his entire body. Johnny staggered, his mind flooded with an overwhelming sense of movement, like he was seeing 1,000 possibilities unfold at once. His vision blurred, the world around him taking on a translucent, ethereal quality. He could see everything. The mill wasn't just a building anymore, it was alive with layers of data and history. Ghostly echoes of other Vandukes flickered into view around him, brief silhouettes of men and women, each carrying their own burdens, their own battles. Some worked at forges, others trained, their forms striking at invisible enemies. For a heartbeat, Johnny swore he saw the hunter himself, leaning over a table similar to his own, scrawling notes onto a map. "What the hell is this?" Johnny whispered, his voice cracking. "Free will mode," the orphan replied, arms spread as though he were introducing a masterpiece. "It's a part of your call sign that only activates when you let go of the boundaries you've set for yourself. You're seeing the loom mill and everything tied to it as it exists across the timelines. All the work. All the versions of you." Johnny turned on the spot, breathless. Everywhere he looked, layers of reality folded over each other. His mill. The hunter's mill. Other mills, some vibrant and filled with light, others decrepit, hollowed out after losing a battle. He could feel their energy, their stories. The call sign doesn't just connect you to other versions of yourself, the orphan continued, his voice echoing softly in this strange, augmented space. It connects you to their experience, their knowledge. Free will mode taps into that. Johnny's head spun as he focused on the VCSN. As he thought about it, new interfaces opened, an arsenal manifesting in his mind, schematics for traps, blueprints for weapons, records of battles fought and won. He could see the exact trap the hunter used to fight Wendigos. He could feel the fire that had burned through the false storyteller's forces in another version of the mill. Johnny stumbled, gripping the edge of the workbench to steady himself. The weight of the knowledge pressed against him, threatening to crush him. "This is too much." The orphan stepped forward, his voice softer now. "Yeah, it's a lot. But you don't have to use it all at once. This is your edge, Johnny. Every Vanduke carries a little piece of each other's legacy. Free will mode lets you access it, gives you the tools you need, when you need them." Johnny's breathing slowed, his pulse steadying as he focused. Slowly, the overwhelming flood of possibilities faded into manageable glimpses. He could feel the balance returning, the call sign humming at a softer rhythm on his arm. He looked up at the orphan, his eyes sharp. "So I can see their moves. Their traps. Their victories. And their failures," the orphan added with a shrug. "We've all lost battles, too. But knowing what not to do is just as important." Johnny stared at the glowing device on his arm. It was no longer just a tool, it was a living connection to something bigger. He didn't just carry the weight of one fight. He carried the knowledge of every Vanduke who had come before him, and everyone that would come after. You're starting to see it, aren't you? The orphan asked, that mischievous grin softening into something almost proud. You're not alone in this, Johnny. Even when it feels like you are. Johnny's lips curled into a faint smirk. Then I guess I'd better start using this thing properly. The orphan laughed, clapping his hands together. Now you're getting it? Just don't let it go to your head, big guy. The glow of the VCSN dimmed, and the mill snapped back to normal. The echoes of other timelines faded, leaving only Johnny, the orphan, and the quiet hum of the generator. Ren and Scotty were still frozen in shock, completely unprepared for what they'd just witnessed. Scotty pointed at Johnny's arm, his voice trembling. Okay, what the actual hell was that? Ren's face was unreadable, but her tone was sharp. Johnny, what did you just do? Johnny flexed his fingers, feeling the hum of the call sign deep in his bones. He glanced at the orphan, who winked at him knowingly, then turned to his friends. I unlocked something new, Johnny said simply. And we're going to use it? Ren frowned, her skepticism warring with trust. To do what? Johnny picked up the engraved revolver from the table, its weight familiar now, as though it had always belonged to him. He turned the cylinder, the faint glow of the runes catching the light. To fight smarter. To fight harder. And to win. The orphan stretched, yawning dramatically. And that, my friends, is why I showed up tonight. He turned toward Johnny with a grin. Don't forget you've got free will now. Use it wisely. Before anyone could reply, the orphan snapped his fingers again, and with a faint buzz, he was gone, leaving the room silent. Scotty let out a long groan, collapsing back onto a crate. I hate everything about that kid. Ren ignored him, looking at Johnny with new determination. So what's the plan, boss? What do we do next? Johnny looked at the VCSN on his arm, feeling the hum of infinite possibilities. Ren snorted, though she was still processing it herself. I don't know what's weirder, the fact that he's another version of Johnny, or the fact that he's exactly like Johnny, just shorter and more annoying. Hey, Johnny shot back, mock offended. I'm right here. Scotty pointed accusingly at Johnny, his voice breaking into a mix of exasperation and disbelief. Yeah, well, that kid isn't normal, Johnny. He just appeared out of nowhere, talked about haunted pizza robots and multiversal forts, and vanished into thin air. That's not normal. That's not. Johnny raised his hands to calm him, still smirking. Relax, Scotty. I told you this is bigger than us. And trust me, the orphan's harmless. He's just bored. Scotty's voice rose. Bored. He's a cosmic teenage gremlin with powers. Johnny laughed again, finally shaking his head. Yeah. And you'd better get used to it. Because if that's me at 13, I'm only going to get worse. Scotty groaned, slumping back against the wall as Ren chuckled beside him. I hate the multiverse, Scotty muttered. Johnny smirked, crossing his arms as the VCSN device hummed faintly on his arm. Nah, you love it? You just don't know it yet.